Good evening. My name is Shahiem Patel, and on behalf of everybody at Region Business School, I'd like to welcome you this evening to our live coverage from a sunny Cape Town of the 2023 National Budget Speech Discussion Program. We are coming live from our campus, which has been newly renovated and installed with the latest technology in Woodstock, Cape Town. So I invite you to make a turn past the campus and explore all of the offerings that are available at our new campus, which is really, really exciting. In terms of this evening, our program is very simple. It's a discussion which unpacks the budget speech that was delivered earlier this afternoon by Minister Enoch Godongwana. And what does it mean specifically for you and I as South Africans? What has he got right? What has he got wrong? How have we interpreted his budget speech? And like I said, what does it mean in the pocket of the everyday South African? He had a very, very challenging task to deliver this particular budget speech because it's in the context of the worst load shedding that we've ever seen in the country. It's in the context of increasing global uncertainty. It's in the context of volatile financial markets. It's in the context of incredibly challenging business operating environments. And so really and truly, the finance minister's task was not easy. It's for us now this afternoon, or rather this evening, to understand what that means from a macro as well as a micro perspective. To that end, I've been fortunate and blessed to be joined in studio by two very important guests who I will introduce very shortly. But suffice to say that for those of you who are joining us online, we welcome you as well, and we look forward to your participation. Please feel free at any point during the discussion to contribute to the discussion, make use of the chat facility online, and we'll definitely pose those questions or comments to our in-studio panel. Let me now introduce my first guest, who is to my immediate right, Nomathibana Matshoba, who is the MD and Senior Portfolio Manager at Terebinth Capital. Nomathibana is the Managing Director of the Cape Town-based boutique asset management firm, Terebinth Capital, where she's the equity partner and senior portfolio manager. In her role as MD, she oversees the strategic direction of the business. She also has portfolio management responsibilities across fixed income product sets, including strategic and enhanced income, as well as bond and hedge mandates. She has a wide-ranging experience in the financial services industry, having previously worked at Catalyst Fund Managers, where she specialized in listed property analysis. Prior to Catalyst, she co-managed the strategic cash funds at Coronation Fund Managers, where she also had responsibilities in credit and general fixed income research. She has worked at the Old Mutual Group, most recently as a senior strategy analyst in the Old Mutual Emerging Markets team. Nomathibana has a Bachelor of Business Science degree with a major in Actuarial Sciences, and she is also a CFA charter holder. She holds a Master of Philosophy degree with a major in Mathematics of Finance from the University of Cape Town. And Terebinth is a wholly manager-owned and is majority female-owned with a level 2 BB, broad-based Black economic empowerment status. Nomathibana, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. My next guest is Mr. Nadir Thokan, who is the Head of Investment Consulting Strategy at Alexforbes. After obtaining a Bachelor of Economic Science degree majoring in Finance, Economics, and Mathematics, as well as a BCom Honors degree in Finance from the University of Witwatersrand, Nadir entered the asset management industry. Nadir has been in the asset manager industry since 2011, performing the roles of manager of research, analyst, investment strategist, portfolio manager, investment director, and chief investment director. In his capacity as a portfolio manager and chief investment officer, Nadir has won a series of awards, including 3 Raging Bull Awards and 2 Morningstar Awards. He was also nominated for ABSA Investment Strategist of the Year. Nadir has written many in-depth market research and investment commentary pieces over the course of his career, and is a regular financial markets commentator on CNBC Africa, Business Day TV, ENCA, SABC, 702, and SAFM. Nadir's moved to another multi-manager to become the lead portfolio manager for their global equity strategy, where he remained there for 4 years as a lead portfolio manager for both global equity funds and a global multi-asset fund. Thereafter, Nadir was approached by a large US-based global multi-manager firm, SEI Investments, to be the technical resource on the ground in South Africa. Currently, Nadir heads up investment consulting strategy at Alexforbes South Africa, which is the largest multi-manager in the country. This role entails devising investment best practice frameworks, contributing to consulting forums and channels, driving investment strategy on behalf of Alexforbes consulting clients, and designing a number of frameworks, including ESG frameworks, integrating into retirement funds, as well as investment frameworks for the group. It is my great pleasure to welcome Mr. Nadir Thokan.
Thanks, Shahiem. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. It's a great pleasure to have both of you. I think opening remarks in terms of what Minister Enoch Godongwana had spoken about, like I said, the context was really, really difficult. It was a challenging budget speech to deliver. And I think if I can just get into the meat of what is required from a good budget speech, economic growth is at the heart of any good budget speech. And the elephant in the room is always going to be growth being driven through stable supply of energy through Eskom. And I think that, that is probably where we should start our discussion. And really, if I look back to the medium-term budget speech from last year in October, when, again, at the time, context was Eskom was sort of in 400 billion rand debt, and there were commitments being made to take on half or even 2/3 of that debt onto the government's balance sheet or the sovereign balance sheet. And today, we sort of got some answers as to whether or not that was going to materialize and in what form and what shape. But I think the important thing, when I spoke about it in my introductory remarks, I said, we need to understand what this means for the South Africa. What does it mean to take on half or 2/3 of Eskom's debt onto the sovereign balance sheet of the nation? What does it mean for the South African? And if you think about it again, like I say, through the elephant in the room, which is Eskom, one would assume that saving of the cost of debt that was meant to be the relief to Eskom, it would be to go ahead and maintain a better infrastructure, do a lot more maintenance, so that, for example, load shedding would be, instead of balancing load shedding stages 4 to 6, you might be balancing load shedding from stages 2 to 3, and that enables some kind of room for economic growth. Let me start with you, Nomathibana, and get your views on sort of this going in position of Eskom being the big ticket item of the budget speech.
Oh, it's quite a loaded question. I'm not even sure if it's a question. I think if I step back and just think about what makes a good budget, which you initially talked about, there's 3 main components in how I see it. There's the revenue component, there's expenditure component, and then there's the debt. So in this case, a good budget would be one where we're seeing a consistent growth in revenue, and that will be driven by your growth question, which you're asking right now. And then from the expenditure side, you want to see a control of expenditure. And most importantly, you want to see that over your expenditure framework. So we typically will do a 3-year expenditure framework. So we'll have a budget for 3 years. So you want to see that growth moving up and the expenditure that there's control. And then from a debt perspective, you want to see that debt going down. So now from an Eskom perspective, the impact of Eskom in the budget is obviously on the revenue number, because then it impacts the potential growth in the economy. So that's why measures had to be introduced in this budget, because it's really, as you mentioned, it's the elephant in the room in terms of us getting the growth picture right. If we don't get Eskom right, we can never get that growth picture right.
Yeah, I think you're quite right, especially the point that you made around control of expenditure, which is one that we should definitely circle back to, because I think that it's well and good to say, well, we need to make sure Eskom is efficient, Eskom is keeping the lights on, but at what cost? And what does that mean again on the balance sheet? What does that mean for the average South African? Nadir, if I can bring you into the conversation, let's circle back to the idea of government taking on between 50% or 2/3 of the debt of Eskom, right? The finance minister today spoke about that number, and he actually made commitments and said we've got a much clearer picture as to how much of that debt will be taken on. What did you make of what Minister Godongwana had said?
Yeah, so I think the big thing is that it now gives the market certainty. So, we're not in that 50% to 2/3 number anymore, debating what is it going to be, what's going to be the impact on the debt to GDP trajectory, because that's a lot of questions, because the ratings agencies are looking at that. It's not going to be a question of, is Eskom going to now have the balance sheet to finally start doing more maintenance in the short term and improving generation capacity or adding generation capacity in the long term. So we're starting to get a clearer picture of how that's looking now. So bottom line is the number is 254 billion rand.
Yeah.
254 billion rand that's been taken off Eskom's balance sheet onto the sovereigns. I think the rating agencies have been pricing this in for a long time. The market's been pricing this in for a long time. Nomathibana is a fixed income manager, so she'll speak with a lot more authority around, but our bond yields have been elevated relative to our emerging market peers, relative to global developed market peers. Our bond yields, our cost of borrowing money has been elevated for a long time because this was priced in.
Yes.
So we got it out the way today. We ripped the band-aid off. It's going to be 254 billion. Nomathibana mentioned it's a very, very important thing to do. Because the South African economy, look, if we don't sort out Eskom, we can talk about as much as we want to about consolidating expenditure, about debt to GDP. We're going to slow bleed. It's death by 1,000 cuts because we are not going to get growth. We're not going to tackle our unemployment problem. We're not going to get more equality in South Africa. We're not going to be able to pay more social grants because we're not going to have the revenue to do it. So, if you think about it as a patient in ICU, no one wants to be in ICU, but we're here now, right? So we need to treat the cause of the very bad infection, and the cause of the very bad infection is Eskom. Now there might be some side effects of the medication you're getting in ICU, but the side effects are far better than the patient dying, so to speak, and that's really where we are. So not a nice thing to take on, because ultimately we're going to pay more, about 35 billion rand more in service, or 30 billion rand more in servicing this debt every year. Our debt to GDP is going to take longer to stabilize, but so those are not nice things, but it is a necessary thing to do so we can ramp up the growth side of the equation and keep those taxes, the revenue side going, so we can do all the things we want to do.
Okay, so now if I deconstruct the point made by Nomathibana and the points made by yourself, and if I bring it down to a conversation at a braai, at a typical South African home, all that the South African Joe public is hearing, 254 billion rand of Eskom's debt is being brought into the government's coffers, onto the government's balance sheet, and the average South African is well enough aware of the fact that that's a cost that's going to be passed on to them, which fuels a lot of anger. And it's a case of, well, when you even add the context of accusations of bribery and corruption at places like Eskom, it fuels the anger even further, right? When you put that against the backdrop of 33% unemployment rate in South Africa at a conservative level, I think unofficially we know it's a lot higher than that. If you think about South Africa having the third worst unemployment rate in the world, even at that lower number, if you think about things like 300 billion rand to service debt, which is probably going to be more like 400 billion in the next 3 years or some time to come. When you think about things like our ability as a nation to attract foreign investment, our ability to attract domestic, local investment, all of these things become fuel to the fire at a braai, if you can pardon the pun. And so again, like I mentioned at the beginning, what we're going to try and do is maintain a theme of what does it mean. And so what would be probably the silver lining to that dark cloud that hangs over that kind of a conversation? Maybe Nomathibana, you can take a stab at it. I know I'm asking you all the loaded questions, but you seem to have all the loaded answers. So let's go into your view.
So the easy response firstly is we have to realize that there was already over 300 billion government guaranteed. I think it's about 350 billion government guarantee that Eskom already have, which implicitly means that it will have been taken into account when we look at the national government's debt. So this is the way now of physically moving that debt. So I know it's a bit of a technical answer, but so what they've done is not necessarily increasing the national government's debt more than what it was. It's just bringing that debt into the or ensuring that the cash now goes out of the national governments. But otherwise, from how we looked at the credit worthiness, if you think about it, if you are guaranteeing someone's debt, it impacts your credit worthiness. So currently, national governments was guaranteeing Eskom's debt. So it was already taken into account when we're looking at our credit worthiness. In terms of how it's been done, I think it's important that the number is big, but we need to split it out in terms of how they've done it. There's 180 that is going to service debt as it matures at Eskom and any interest cost. And then there's an additional 70 million or so that's only going to be made available towards the 2025-2026 year, because there's a balloon payment that's expected there for Eskom. And it's important that they've structured it as a debt, because it means that National Treasury still has control on what exactly Eskom does, as opposed to just taking 250 million and putting it to Eskom. Because then the issue about corruption that we've seen at Eskom, they can pretty much operate with no oversight, or not necessarily with no oversight, but basically they can continue doing as they please. There's conditions attached to this amount. It basically, one of the conditions they've mentioned, which is one of the chapters, is saying that every time we put the money down, there's a certain list of items that you need to do. If you do these items, we'll convert that debt into an equity injection. And if you don't do it, it remains as a debt in the balance sheet of Eskom. So it's a nice way to ensure that, because previously, if you think of, and this is the issue with SOEs, the oversight has been sitting at different departments, whether it's the energy department, whether it's transport, etc. And National Treasury is the one that has to pay the bill, and they have zero oversight on what exactly these SOEs do. This way ensures that National Treasury now has control. They have a say in how things are because they've put out things that needs to happen in order for them to convert that debt into equity, which is important. So for the person on the street, it's basically just understanding this is not just money being thrown into them and then we stand away. It also ensures that National Treasury will have an oversight there.
So I think if I'm to summarize your point, Nomathibana, number one, the average South African can take solace in the fact that we've already felt the pain for what we've seen today coming out of the budget speech some time ago, because that's the point in time when commitments were made. So it's not as though we're going to take a hit as a result of us taking on this debt. That's point number one. Point number two being that the way in which this money is being made available is not a gift, it's not a handout, it's not a bailout in the colloquial sense. There's a lot more structure to it, which many things are conditional upon. And because those conditions need to be met, there's safeguards built into it, which can put you and I at some level of ease that says, you know what, actually, the money is not just being thrown into a dark hole and we're hoping for the best. So I think then, Nadir, if we're still keeping to the tune of what do we mean for the average South African, and we move slightly away from Eskom, and we move to the very closely associated issue of growth, which we touched on in the opening set of remarks. There's this weird misnomer that's been happening between Treasury and the Reserve Bank, and Treasury overstating, let me not say overstating, but stating a much higher trajectory or a forecast for growth in the economy of about 0.9%. And then at a lower end, you've got the Reserve Bank forecasting at a low of about 0.3%, which is almost 3 times as much as the other. And so what do you say about this idea of overstating and or understating of a growth trajectory, and what does it mean for South Africa? Again, a loaded question, but we'll unpack it further.
So I think both overstating and understating comes with its own unique set of risks, right? So the overstating is the more obvious set of risks, because if you are overestimating what growth is going to be within a budget, you are overestimating how much revenue you're going to collect, and you're overestimating how much money you can spend without your debt metrics getting worse. So think about it in terms of a household, if you're going to try and make it simpler. If you're saying I'm currently earning X, I'm going to get a 20% increase next year. I can afford to take on more debt this year because that 20% increase is coming.
Yeah.
Now, if it turns out that you actually only get a 10% increase, but you increase the amount of debt you're taking on in your household by 20%, you all of a sudden got a problem because your cost of servicing your debt is starting to rise quicker than your income is rising.
Yes.
And that obviously results in a worsened debt profile. So when you go to the bank and you want to get more debt, what are they going to do? Charge you more interest for money that they lend you.
Yes.
What does that mean? Any future salary you earn, more of it is going to go towards servicing that debt. It's no different at a national level.
Yes.
If we overstate our revenue expectations and we under-deliver, the market punishes us by charging us more, by charging South Africa more to lend us money, and we get charged more to borrow that money, which means that 300 billion rand number that you mentioned at the start of the discussion, that that's going towards servicing our debt, that 300 billion rand number all of a sudden starts to become 350 billion, 360 billion, and 400 billion. So all the tax cuts that we want, all the increased expenditure on social grants that we want, all the cuts in fuel levies that we want, those things cannot happen if we continuously under delivering on the revenue component, and we're spending more of our taxpayers' money on servicing debt. We have less money available to do other things.
Okay.
So that's the obvious risk. The risk of understating growth. Yes. Is that you don't stimulate the economy enough. So we know the consumer is in trouble. We know food inflation's at a 15-year high.
Yeah.
So we know that's hurting the consumer. Now, one of the things that the minister mentioned in the budget today is the diesel rebates for the food manufacturers. And the reason for that is because he's trying to keep the cost of food low, as these guys got to run generators to keep their operations going.
Yeah.
Now, if we underestimate growth, it means that the extent of those levies are too low, and we can't combat the kind of the cost of that increase, the cost of those food price increases. Yes. So both of them come with their own unique set of risks. In terms of the reality, we're probably somewhere in between. It's not going to be as low as 0.3%. It's not going to be as high as 0.9%.
Yeah.
Having said that, Treasury estimated 1.5% growth for 2022 at the medium-term budget policy statement, and we ended up outperforming that by about 1% actually. So it's not, Treasury doesn't consistently overpromise and underdeliver. I think that's the important.
That's the important point.
And the other things that we have collected more taxes than we budgeted for by about 90 billion. And that's what's allowing us to fund a lot of the things like continuation of the COVID relief grant, offering more grant in terms of the diesel rebates, offering tax breaks on installing solar. All those things are made possible because we collected more revenue, despite the fact that the economy is very slow. So delicate balancing act.
Sorry, before we carry on, I just wanted to make a point around the debt, because you asked the question about whether it's going to impact the man on the street on the ESCOM. I just want to make the point that the projection, which is obviously important, Nadir talked about the projection. The projected debt is going to be higher.
Yeah.
But what National Treasury has done is they can play around with how we fund ourselves by funding on what we call the short term of the curve. So that's where, for instance, if you for instance want to borrow money, if you borrow a 20-year loan, you're going to pay more.
Yes.
Whereas if you borrow, like take a 1-year loan, it's going to be less. So that's how the balancing act they are doing, so that although the eventual debt is going to be higher, they're playing around with the funding so that it has a minimal impact on us.
Okay. Here's maybe a very oversimplified question. If the average South African gets wind of the fact that Treasury is estimating growth at 0.9% and the Reserve Bank is estimating it somewhere around 0.3%, they kind of tend to clump institutions in this broad bucket of government. And it will be like, again, if I'm trying to play out conversations that happen in everyday life, they don't even know whether or not growth will be 0.9%. They can't even get that right. And perhaps it's a lack of understanding the technicalities and the realities of how the economy is constructed, how our institutions are constructed, and the interplay between all of these, right? But I think these conversations are ideal opportunities for us to share some insight around how these things actually work, almost a peek behind the curtain for the average person on the street, so that whether you're a student online, whether you're somebody from industry, from government, you have a greater sense of these realities, because more often than not, people who are meant to be in the know also are not quite in the know. And maybe there's some idea that either one of you or both of you can share in terms of those kind of structural realities of our economy.
So is the question more about the differences in how these two institutions kind of make the assumptions? I mean, the simple answer is that these two institutions are looking at two separate policies. National Treasury is about fiscal policy, and the Reserve Bank is about monetary policy. These institutions have different mandates that they need to address. So in line with what Nadir said about that growth assumption is 100% correct. And then another thing I'll just add is about the wage setting, especially if you are too bullish on your growth projection, because we have a bargaining council type of a wage setting. So if you are very optimistic, then these guys are going to say, hang on, I want actually 15% wage increase because you can afford it. So they need to balance it well. That's one of the things that they need to do. So in line with what he described the fiscal policy side very well. And then from a monetary policy, which is where the Reserve Bank, that one is about making sure that there's price stability in the economy. So essentially, we want an economy where inflation is not too low because we don't want a Japan situation, but at the same time, it's not too high. So we don't want a Venezuela type of situation. We want it nicely set between 3% and 6%. So in order for them to do that, they have to have a realistic picture of what growth is going to do in the future. And then from growth perspective, then they can have an idea of what the inflation numbers are going to be in the future. And then that's how they'll set policy. So they operate independently. Okay.
And I think that's probably useful, like I say, if we're trying to keep this as non-technical as possible, it's probably useful just in terms of the lay understanding of why there's a difference in the first place, why the difference is seemingly very large. And sort of it's just because of the angle and the lens through which one looks at often not necessarily the same thing, but connected things in the same circle. So I think that sort of brings everybody into light in terms of the variance between the two growth projections. We've got a few questions online. The first question, I think, is from the name's a bit unclear, but the question is, the budget presented to the nation, through my perspective, is to cripple working class while economic recovery is in a dire disaster with regards to the maintenance. The utility we developed to minority, this is very unclear, minority, then it happens to have overwhelmed by the exclusion of citizens into the grid. I think I'm getting that right, but the gist of it is sort of touching similarly as we've been talking about. It's about Eskom's ability to deliver power into the grid, to have stability of the supply of power, and this person is feeling marginalized and sort of feeling excluded from that process. Any comments on that? I mean, it's probably again one of the loaded questions, and it seems like it's a theme for tonight, Nomathibana. So maybe you want to take the next loaded question again.
I think the question is about the impact of Eskom on the man on the street. I think, if anything, this is the budget that really tries to address the Eskom issue. Everyone, before the budgets before have been, it's been band-aids, as you mentioned, just 20 billion there, but we know that the number is very big. So this is the one budget that says, let's actually have a plan in place to address the problem with Eskom. And the long-term picture, obviously, is that it's going to benefit the man on the street. That's the law. It's not going to be immediate, because once we have stability in the energy supply, then businesses can thrive, people can get to work. And then from that growth, that's when we're going to start having an improvement in revenue. And then that's how the government can afford so many of the services that they need to provide for us.
So I think, Nomathibana, if I really understand you correctly, in today's budget speech, the minister was bold. The minister showed courage insofar as the Eskom issue is concerned. It might not land necessarily in the way that everybody wants it to, but at the very least, we've got some kind of certainty and direction in terms of what's to come, which I think is very valuable. We've got some people online. I think it's a lot clearer now. We've got some people online who've just greeting from different parts of South Africa. We've got somebody saying hello from China, which is amazing. Somebody from Zambia as well. Hello to all of you online. Cameroon, which is really encouraging to see a global audience. We've got a comment as well. 254 billion to the coffers of state-owned, state removed from Eskom's balance sheet. For what exactly? Now tariffs have been increased, but Eskom is being bailed out with what money while we have a high rate of unemployment? I think we, in many ways, touched on these issues and dealt with them, but maybe just in a word or two, Nadir, your response to this idea that we're still seeing increases in the price of electricity. With all said and done, if Eskom's got seemingly less burden of debt because of the transfer of 254 billion onto the government's or the sovereign balance sheet, why then are we still seeing prices increase for electricity?
Well, because Eskom's finances are in such a dire state. So what we're hoping is that so again, as Nomathibana mentioned, meeting stringent conditions means a transfer of that 254 billion over. If Eskom meet those stringent conditions, let's assume they meet those stringent conditions over the next 3 years and the full 254 is transferred over. That's going to result in lower increases in electricity tariffs going forward because Eskom has more free cash flow to do what they need to do. So the problem at the moment, Shahiem, and maybe specifically to this listener, is that we have to take the bitter medicine at this point. Yeah. We don't like it. Yeah. We've all been sick with an infection. We all had to take Augmentin. It tastes horrible. Yeah. But if we want to get better, we have to take it. So we all have to take the bitter medicine now to deal with the issues of unemployment, to deal with the issues of high electricity, to deal with the issues of low growth. We have to take the tough decisions now. And this is unfortunately one of those tough decisions we have to take. But there are guardrails being put in place. Yeah. It's not going to be Medupi and Kusile 2.0 where they run 100% over budget and the government just keeps paying and they don't deliver and they keep paying and the chimney collapses and they keep paying. It's not going to be that 2.0. The conditions put in place to unlock that financing is very, very stringent.
Okay. So again, if we think about it as a silver lining to a dark cloud, if you use the analogy of an infection and sort of taking the right medication, although painful and horrible as it may be, it's for a longer term gain. Okay. And I suppose maybe there's the issue of things potentially having to get a little bit worse before things get better, which is quite clear, or at least becoming quite clear. But let's again try and look at the positives wherever they may exist, right? The finance minister had made some commitments around rebates for individuals who are generating their own clean energy, right? And we've seen elsewhere in the world where this has worked, and I think there's a case in Vietnam where over a 1 year period where they had a similar kind of crisis in terms of energy and power generation and so forth. And state rebates were offered to individuals who were allowed to generate their own power, and within 1 year, about 9,000 megawatts was generated, which is the equivalent of about 2 Medupis. So I think that if we really are to look for a positive, there's something of the ball being in our court as an everyday South African now, is to say, well, okay, for those who are in a position to afford alternative clean energy, then go and generate 2 Medupis on behalf of the government, so to speak, right? But the reality again becomes, how many of the South African people can afford that? There again, you still have to caveat the positive with some kind of harsh realities of South African life. Nomathibana, your view?
It's exactly that, in that it's about affordability. It's a great initiative from the retail consumer. Those who can afford it, definitely it's a no-brainer. The only thing I would say, especially for someone who actually is trying to get those solar panels, is can we get these solar panels into this country? Because currently we just have the people who are supplying them have so many backlogs. So we need to get these solar panels. That's one thing. What I would say though is we needed a better incentive for the companies, because at the end of the day, those are the big consumers. Those are the ones that can actually make a dent if we get them off the grid. And those are the ones who actually have the balance sheet to actually make this type of investments. Yes, they've made an incentive. I think it's about 125% tax rebate or something of the sort to the expenditure that they've put in place. I don't know if I'll be interested to see what companies are saying about that. But I think that's the industry as a quick way to sort the energy. If we were to give a proper rebate to those guys, because once we get the big consumers out, then it solves a lot of problems.
Correct.
Yeah.
I agree 100% with it. So I think let's break down and then the other things that I think it only applies for 1 year.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you have 1 March 2023 to I don't know if 24 is a leap year. I think it is till 29 April 24 to install the solar to get the tax break.
Yeah.
So as Nomathibana mentioned, there's some supply bottlenecks in terms of getting these solar panels in.
Yeah.
Is everyone going to make that cutoff date? Is it going to be? I think at the very least it has to be extended because of the bottlenecks.
Yeah.
Whether that happens or not, we'll hear in the medium-term budget policy statement, etc. But again, so if we break down the numbers, so if a company spends R1 million installing solar capacity, okay, you take 125% of that, that's 1.25 million rand. At the current company tax rate, that's about a tax saving of 338,000 odd rand that the company is getting in terms of a tax rebate for installing the solar. Now, for big users of electricity that can install quickly with the right financial incentive, I think that's pretty conservative.
Yeah.
But look, it's a start, it's a step in the right direction. Let's see if that one gets extended at the medium-term budget policy statement, and two, if they get more aggressive about it, particularly if they get close to that 0.9% economic growth rate, and SARS finds 1 or 2 dark holes where they can collect more tax, then we perhaps can get a bit more aggressive on that front.
And this is one of those where the revenue windfall we got via the mining companies is an opportunity for us to actually have utilized to say, let's give these guys, because we know that we have so much money in the bank, let's actually give the big users a bigger incentive to actually utilize or to actually install their backup power.
Correct. So it's interesting you mentioned sort of the tax the windfall that we got in the last financial year, right? But I think that if we look at the sort of commodities super cycle and increased prices, which led to increased revenue, that benefit, that sort of stroke of luck, if you could call it that way, is set to run out at some point soon, I would imagine. It's not the kind of thing that we can depend on going forward as a feature of the economy. It's just merely a phase in a cycle of a super cycle for commodities, right? And so if you consider then that, is that factored into how the growth forecasts are being set by the Reserve Bank and the Treasury respectively? Does that have a role to play in either one of the two, or is that just an anomaly which has nothing to do?
Yeah, so I think it's an anomaly. So if you'll hear Governor Khanyago talk about it, you'll hear Finance Minister Godongwana talk about it, that this is a once-off windfall. We cannot depend on this revenue on an ongoing basis. And again, I think as Nomathibana mentioned earlier, it's an anchoring point or putting a stake in the ground to say, guys, we cannot spend this money as if it's here forever, where we incur permanently 90 billion rand in additional expenditure. We cannot do that.
Yes.
So that's what they've continuously reiterated. Again, I think they could have been a bit bolder though, because I think, the tax breaks for the electricity, I think in total amounts to about 15 billion rand or whatever it is. And I think, they could have ramped that up significantly, because the multiplier effect of sorting out the electricity crisis will be multi years to come, right? So it would have been a very productive use of the once-off windfall we got. Having said that, we are where we are. He's doing a very difficult balancing act, because the rating agencies are watching us like a hawk.
Yes.
We said primary surplus by 23-24. We're pretty much there. And we said debt is going to stabilize by 24-25. We're pushing that out by a year because we're already bailing Eskom out. Yes. So, we're starting to push the rating agencies' patience a little bit by, pushing these things out a little bit further. So we all would have wanted them to be a bit more aggressive, but I'm sure, behind closed doors, there's some very hard conversations happening with the rating agencies as well.
Yeah.
And Nomathibana is a bond manager.
I see that we've got more comments and questions on our chat, which is very encouraging. Please keep them coming. More people from abroad, from Eswatini, saying hello. But I think just in terms of some of the questions, we've got a comment from Ronald Blom, but it will then be those who can afford and pay for the electricity to stop saving the electricity. It will only reduce Eskom's budget. We've got more economic recovery will not happen now as long as the rolling blackouts is crippling SMMEs. As I am attending this webinar, I am in the dark for 4 hours of blackout. Intensification of energy needs to be tackled as of yesterday, as many bailouts happened in the utility. Eskom rates hike up yearly, and debts being harmonized by the budget do not guarantee municipality price cap. Cost carried by working class is ramping up indirectly, and there's an emoji with a sad face. It looks Eskom wasn't be on top of the system for long years ago. I think there's just a bit of an issue with, but I think the issue is Eskom not being on top of things for many years. So not everyone can turn their lights on. We've got more comments again. Ronald Blom, Southern Africans who can afford it already paying in addition to their taxes for services that the state is supposed to deliver. Example, security, education, energy, local government services. This is rewarding bad behavior. I think it's an important point, and I'm going to just read one or two more comments from the chat line, but I want to return to the point about the sort of narrative that this kind of move by government to sort of, in inverted commas, bail out Eskom is breeding bad behavior, and it's almost becoming outsourcing government service delivery to the general public. I think I need to circle back to that. But if I just can read a few more comments. Since the state of public hospitals is overwhelmed, when will the NHI take place to better the lives of ordinary citizens who doesn't have medical aids? How does the 2023 budget allocate resources to support the growth and development of SMMEs? And what is the impact likely to have on job creation and poverty reduction? So I think let's focus on two. We've got the comment from Ronald Blom and we've got the comment from Brandon Govender. Let's start with the comment about rewarding bad behavior, i.e. doing the job of government, which they should have been doing in the first instance. I think that we should be very clear not to step too closely into the political discussion around what might be driving some of that, but just your view, perhaps, Nadir, how would you respond to that kind of a comment or question?
So we're starting to incentivize the right behavior. I think the thing we've said a number of times is that the conditions to get the money is extremely stringent. So, we're starting to take steps to deal with the governance challenges that we have had. We understand there's obviously going to be public anger, frankly, because the economy has gone nowhere for a decade and a half, and it feels like we just keep on forking out more and more and more. But just to pick up on some of the threads of the other things like education, NHI, better healthcare. If we want all of those visions for South Africa in the foreseeable future, this is money which is very necessary to spend to tackle the only way we sort out South Africa's problems is by bootstrapping economic growth. Yes. Economic growth creates more jobs, gives us salary increases, gives us tax increases, and allows us to address all these issues. If we do not get economic growth, we're gonna struggle to meet all of those mandates.
Yes.
If we want economic growth, we need stable electricity. Correct. Now. So this is necessary for stable electricity. In terms of incentivizing the bad behavior, that's where the stringent conditions come in. Yes. In order to unlock. Correct. The financing. That's why it's been band-aid, as Nomathibana said, because we didn't want, or the finance ministry didn't want to just open the checkbook and say come. Yes. So, and when they finally did open the checkbook, it's on very stringent conditions. So
the finance minister has gone further than perhaps other finance ministers, or he himself may have gone in the past, but perhaps maybe one could argue he could have gone even further. And I think that's perhaps the challenge, that balancing act that you referred to earlier, that inextricable link between growth and Eskom. Yes. And the supply of electricity. Yes. I think I mentioned, Brandon had an interesting point or question. How does the 2023 budget allocate resources to support growth and development of SMMEs, and what is the impact likely to be on job creation and poverty reduction? We touched on it a bit earlier, Nomathibana, but anything to expand upon in relation to Brandon's question?
So from the energy supply, it's a ripple effect in terms of once we have the energy problem sorted, then growth should in theory start to improve to the benefit of small and medium enterprises and also to the benefit of the unemployment problem that we're currently seeing. It's not going to be immediate, unfortunately. It's one of those where you set the environment correct such that all of these institutions, such as the small and medium enterprises, can thrive.
Yes.
From an immediate perspective, that's where poverty alleviation becomes important. We do have the COVID relief grants.
Yes.
They've maintained them until, I believe, March 2024.
Yes.
So that's something that's going to aid the individuals who suffered basically from the COVID period because of jobs not being there and some people losing their jobs. So they've maintained that COVID relief grant, and there's no mention of the basic income grant. I mean, for me, that's good, and someone might say it's not necessarily a good thing from a social perspective, but it's also a matter of we can't have an economy that relies only on social relief. We have to get to a point as where we actually promote growth, because from growth, that's when we start getting a job creation happening in the economy, and then that's how people come into the economy. But at the same time, we need this social support to support those individuals, but those cannot be a long-term support measure. We need to, in our projection, there needs to be clear signs of us phasing them out. And I think for me, putting a cutoff timeline to that COVID relief grant of saying 2024 is a way of saying, let's focus on growth. Let's focus on job creation. So therefore we can start phasing out the grants because no one wants to depend on grants forever. I'm sure most average South Africans don't want to be dependent on grants forever.
And I think what you're saying then, Nomathibana, is that the bar is being set very low in terms of saying, well, here's a social grant that should solve a lot of problems. It doesn't. We actually need to get away from that altogether and start to set the bar a lot higher in terms of saying, well, no longer do we depend on a handout or a government grant, so to speak. And now we are actually self-sustaining. We are able to provide for ourselves and our families in ways that we couldn't in the past. When you consider what a large proportion of social grants form part of the budget, that is extremely alarming and concerning in its first instance, which maybe nicely brings us into the next point that I thought we should discuss around what about the consumer and what is happening in the pockets of the consumer relative to today's budget speech. We know that the finance minister has not raised any taxes necessarily. Suffice to say that there are some sin taxes that have been increased and so forth, but by and large, personal and corporate taxes have been left flat, which again, to your point that you just made, Nomathibana, some people will think that's great. Other people will think it's not. And really, there's a lot that sits beneath the relief to the consumer. You mentioned earlier, Nadir, about diesel rebates and for food producers and sort of the 15-year high of food inflation that we're currently seeing. There's a rebate there. So it's aimed at softening the blow of having to pay for diesels to keep a generator on when there's load shedding, which is a great thing. There's no fuel tax levy that's or increase on the fuel tax levy. You mentioned, Nomathibana, about the idea of COVID relief grants being extended into next year. We were talking to some colleagues just after the budget speech, and there was a comment made that said, we can almost price this into the budget going forward as a permanent feature. It was a dangerous idea because that's scary. It was never meant to be that. It was never meant to be something that just people start to rely on. But the reality, again, as we've been saying throughout the conversation, for the average South African, especially those who have been recipients of a COVID-19 grant, they've come to depend so heavily on that is basically something that if you were to take away from them would fundamentally change their quality of life in a very short period of time. And so I think that it's these kind of things. It's the sugar tax that's been, the can has been proverbially kicked down the road for another year. All issues that the finance minister was trying to do to ease the burden on the consumer now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so a lot of those measures, look, we don't have to go through each one of them again. We'll maybe pick up on a couple of them. So the sugar tax is an important one because the sugar industry is a big employer in South Africa. That's the reality. And South Africans do consume sugar. So it has a double impact of kind of heating up food inflation again, and also kind of resulting in some, reduced consumption, which kind of threatens jobs in the sugar industry when we already got high unemployment. So, I think that provides some relief. And then the food sector is a big one. I mean, the average South African spends a big chunk of their income on food. That is food and transport. Those are by far the two biggest components of their monthly expenditure. And if you think about travel expenditure, well, there's no increase in the fuel levy. Unfortunately, we are at the mercy of global oil prices and the exchange rate. And, those are difficult things to predict, but oil prices gradually starting to come down. So, as the oil prices come down, we're not offsetting that by increasing fuel levies. So again, transport costs hopefully can not increase further. And then the other factor is the food producers. So food producers have to run diesel generators quite extensively because of load shedding. And the reality is that means that their profit margins are being squeezed. So if they can claim some of that money they're spending on the diesel back from the fiscus, yes, and as a result of that, prevent the passing on of that cost onto the consumer. Mm. So some limited, and it's not perfect relief. We all want the tax cuts. We all want more social, but within the reality of social grants, within the reality of what government is operating and what the National Treasury is operating within, those are unfortunately not realistic. Yeah. So to the extent that, we're watching the fiscal deficit, we're watching debt to GDP, we're trying to get Eskom going again so we can bootstrap growth. I think those will, however limited, will be welcome relief, welcome by the consumer. Absolutely, I fully agree, Nadir. Let's get back to the chat and pick up on some more comments and questions. Somebody's saying Eskom reminds them of SAA. I suppose it's tongue-in-cheek, Kensani. How do we encourage all stakeholders to honor their debts for SOEs to sustain and afford the desired maintenance? That's from Du. Of course, the COVID relief grants are also coming out of the small tax base, which is spreading very thinly amongst many priorities. It would be good to see some original thinking that will tackle these problems from multiple points of view. All right. Basic income grants is sustainable considering shrinking fiscal envelope. What is crucial is to focus on growth of the economy and as developing nations. That's from Aaron. COVID-19 relief should be basic to basic income grants. However, the country has to improve growth to collect much revenue to fund social cluster. It is more than tax cuts. It is also about food security. I think, a lot of healthy conversation and some good points being made on the chat as well. And please, I invite all of those online to keep those comments and questions coming forward. I think that with the time that we've got left, another burning issue which we've not really touched on, Nomathibana, is the issue of the public wage bill, which has been, by all accounts, bloated to the tune of about 700 billion rand, and which is staggering, right? If we consider the context around the public sector wage bill, unions are demanding increases to the tune of 10%. Government's sort of in the 3% range, which is again significantly far from what is being expected. But if you think about 700 billion rand at a 10% increase, which is an extra 70 billion rand, which is not being budgeted for, and if you're thinking at the lower end of what government's actually budgeting at 3%, more than likely, one would expect that they'll meet somewhere in the middle. I don't know, 5%, 7%, somewhere in that particular range, right? But again, it's not being placed on the budget. So the delta between the 3% and let's call it 5% is a significant number in and of itself, especially when the total number is on a high scale anyway. A high base, right? Yeah. And so really that's the concern. If we think back to, was it last year when there was a sort of a budget of 0% increase and it ended up being 4%. That money needs to be pulled from somewhere else in the budget. And again, we can speak about last year's budget where we had the tax windfall from the super cycle of commodities, but this year that might not persist. And if it does, it certainly won't persist next year. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on what should be done in, again, very loaded Nomathibana, what should be done to manage the inflated public sector wage bill?
So currently, I think this Treasury team has been consistent in saying, whatever increase we give you, needs to be neutral from an expenditure perspective. So how they can do it is, we can give you your increase, but that means that we're going to have cuts, or we're going to have job freezes. And unions don't like that because it means that they have less members. It basically reduces their membership base. So this is currently how they're looking. This is one of the options. And I know that the National Treasury has been using in saying that if the unions are going to be adamant about wanting a very high increase, it's going to impact job creation within the public sector. And then I would say that let's throw it back to people in the public sector and say, do you actually want this? You're going to have a situation where you're going to have less and less people working. I mean, there are departments which are bloated.
Yes.
But there are departments which are struggling, and most of them are primarily in the healthcare sector, which have been really impacted with the job freezes. So this is where I think unions needs to be smart, and especially be more look at your membership base or your sector and be specific. Don't look at it in totality, because there are sectors that are bloated and there should be job cuts there. But then there are sectors that actually cannot necessarily survive without having those people brought in, because I know social workers are in shortage, nurses are in shortage, etc. So it's going to be a balancing act, a difficult balancing act, and it's going to be thrown back at the unions. This is where I see it, and I think as a country, this is one way we throw it back at the unions to actually start making the right decision, to say, let's actually start making decisions that make sense for the economy and the country as a whole.
And what you're saying is absolutely bang on the mark, Nomathibana. I think the idea of the ball being placed in the union's court at this particular stage is absolutely spot on, because they get their support through making grand promises to their constituencies, and they sort of drum up support in that way. But the reality at the negotiation table is not always the same. So there's often a bit of rhetoric that might be involved. There might be a bit of drumming up of support and rallying the troops, so to speak, in terms of saying, this is what we're going to get you. But in knowing full well in the back of their minds that might not be possible. And so, Nadir, maybe you can shed some light on the average South African, as we've been saying throughout this evening. All they hear is 700 billion rand being spent on the public sector wage bill. The borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, taking from one department to give to another department that might be struggling, like the example that you've given of health, can all be understood in its technicalities and its validity altogether. But it doesn't detract from the fact that the South African who is just looking out for a number, 700 billion rand, and they probably thinking to themselves, do you know what I could do with 700 billion? Any idea on how to comment on that conversation at the average South African household?
So I think the number, the numbers, we got to be careful about wanting that number to be cut too much, right? So we need basic services to be delivered. And I think that is critically important. So I'll pitch it at two levels. The first level I'll pitch it at is that who here wants prosecutions from state capture to happen faster?
Everyone.
Right. So if we want prosecutions from state capture to happen faster, how do we do that without a fully equipped, fully serviced National Prosecuting Authority and Investigative Directorate? Where must the money from that come from? I'll pitch it at another level. Who wants to go to, I don't know the hospitals in Cape Town that well, but who wants to go to Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto and wait in a 6-hour queue to get medicine? Nobody. So you know, make peace with the 700 billion rand number and start to let's lobby is the wrong word, but let's urge government to reprioritize how that 700 billion rand is spent between departments. Where there's overstaffing, deal with it. Where there's understaffing, deal with it. So accept the 700 billion rand as a necessary expenditure within the economy and demand more bang for your buck from the 700 billion.
Correct. And I think, Nadir, perhaps the most simplistic way of framing it is 700 billion rand is not the same 700 billion rand that you would have had in your personal bank account. Because if we can overcome that mental hurdle of that astronomical number, Nomathibana,
exactly.
in the grander scheme of things, it may or may not be appropriate. That's a different discussion altogether. But let's get away as South Africans of hearing numbers like 700 billion rand here, 254 billion rand being taken off Eskom's debt and being brought onto the sovereign balance sheet and so forth. I think those are very insightful comments. Let's return to the chat before we head to a closure. I think I don't think the sin tax increase will have a major negative effect. During hard lockdown, I saw firsthand how much people are willing to pay for a pack of cigs. That's from Chandley. If senior managers and directors at Eskom are involved in corruption, Eskom will never be fixed. Sin tax is one of skyrocketing increase. Will this not have negative impact on the employee point of view, as those who are taking sin tax will opt to not? And I suppose it's a typo, and the production will be lower and affect employment. So there's a lot of talk about sin tax, which we'll talk about before we wrap up. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of the discussion. Unions do not look at the state of the country's financial issues. They're only looking at how much they will benefit with those increases. The unions do not look at the scale and weigh on the people's jobs and the exploding stomachs. Wow, that's strong. Meaning the smaller change of 350 rand, I suppose it's rand, is going back to the coffers of state as per taxes. We need to remind ourselves of the 700 billion rand comes out of our taxes, and the basic services are not up to scratch. We need to keep government accountable for our taxes. I think all very valid points. I think nobody is really saying something that is crazy, but what I'm seeing coming out of the chat, which to me is a microcosm of South Africa.
Yeah, absolutely.
It really is representative of, like I said, the average Joe on the street and how they look at things. The comment about unions not looking at certain things and only looking at other things, right? That may or may not be an informed view, but it's a view.
Yes, and but I will say that there's something that, from a national treasury perspective and as Parliament as a whole, and I guess for all the departments that are paid from that 700 billion, there's stuff that they can do. Yeah. The current government inherited a compensation framework, and they just carried on with it. Example, housing allowance, car allowance, and all these other allowances, which in the private sector are not necessarily needed. So those are the things that they can cut off. Yeah. Because that number is also being bloated by all these other extra stuff that are there. So there's something that they can do. I fully agree that from a prioritizing, they need, we can't be, because currently when you have a job freeze, it just affects everyone, irrespective of department, equally. Yeah. That's how it works. But they need to prioritize which areas we can start cutting jobs. And at the same time, from a national treasury, they need to relook those benefits.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's a nuanced discussion around this.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not a black and white discussion.
The 700 billion in and of itself is not a problem or not a problem. Yeah. It's how it's divvied up, and it's how it's divvied up, and how and how much bang you get for that buck. Yeah.
That's fine. That's fine. Nadir, Nomathibana, I think we sort of 2 minutes over our rising time, but there's some healthy conversation still carrying on the chat. Before we go back to the chat, the point about fiscal consolidation, and I think, if you think about, Nadir, you mentioned it, Nomathibana, I think you've also pointed it out at some point during our discussion around rating agencies watching us like a hawk. Their patience might be running thin on certain issues. Our debt trajectory is under scrutiny, slowing growth, like we mentioned all throughout this discussion, increasing debt. What is the outlook for fiscal consolidation in your view, Nomathibana?
I mean, currently in this budget, in line with all budgets, I'll have to say they always commit to the fiscal consolidation path. And it's something that for us in the bond market, we've we used to this. We get the promises every year. What I will say though is, in this budget, they are projecting a primary surplus this year, although small. Yeah. And then most importantly, throughout the medium-term expenditure framework, so the projection period. Whereas previously, we've always seen this primary surplus. So a primary surplus is what you're going to get before you allow for all the costs, the finance costs, etc. Yeah. We've always seen it in the outer year. Now they are projecting it for this. In fact, we're almost at the end of this fiscal year.
Yeah.
They're seeing it for this fiscal year and projecting it throughout.
Yeah.
So I think this is a positive, which is something that it's always been one of the cans that's been rolled.
Yeah.
Now they are committing to the primary surplus as a start.
Yeah.
So I think this is a positive to actually get us to start sticking to that fiscal consolidation path.
Lovely. Nomathibana, thank you. Let me close with some more comments on the chat, and then we'll wrap it up from our perspective. Yeah, so I see that why not create the government create job instead? I said sort of some grammar there. I have read that the South African Police Service is allocated 7.8 billion for 5,000 police trainees per year. This seems too high. Not so. That's from Clindia. The state offers TCT just like in the private sector. Cutting of ministers' allowance will enhance economic recovery and maybe do away with some portfolios as they serve no purpose, such as deputy ministers. I'm glad nobody yet mentioned the Minister of Electricity. We do have too many portfolios. That's an area that presents possible cuts. The business incentives to invest in renewable energy, 125% tax rebate creates a unique opportunity. Buy-in from the mining industry that consumes a third of Eskom's power supply will significantly impact the stability and availability of the grid for the rest of the country. Praveen, excellent comment. Was it us as public employees, they owe us for 2 years without increase, and they are expecting public servants to still perform well as cost of living is more than what we get, especially those who are in lower level salaries. And then we've got to fully agree for some benefits to be scrapped, I would imagine, but the problem most received by executives and members of the cabinet, so it will be difficult for them to reduce their benefits. Approval should be done by cabinet, who is also a beneficial, I would imagine, beneficiary. All right, so I think we're going to call time on the comments on the chat. I really appreciate the comments and questions that have been asked. I think many of them were insightful and were very well placed to our guests in studio. Nomathibana and Nadir, I think before I thank you for your time, some closing remarks and sort of my impressions of this budget speech. From a technical point of view, I think it's been bold. I think it said a lot of what we'd like to hear and a lot of what we'd like to see, even though, to your point, the medicine might not taste as great as we'd like it to taste, but it's medicine that we need nonetheless. Could we have been given higher dosage of the medicine? Sure, perhaps so. But I like the fact that there's some practicality built into this budget speech, which I think might not have always been the case in some previous iterations. But that's my closing comments. Nomathibana, you sort of your outtakes and your overall impression of the budget.
Very hard for me to disagree with those sentiments. There are some concerns on the expenditure side, especially when it comes to wages, but it's something where we're going to see in the next 6 months, or hopefully it's going to start being rolled. If anything, this government or this treasury team is saying, we're not willing, we're willing to actually, or let me put it this way, we're willing to actually negotiate harder. Let's not give up too easily.
Yes.
So that would be an upside, but then again, we know it's an overhang.
Yeah.
It's still an overhang to that expenditure number.
Yeah. Nadir, in summary, Nomathibana and I have looked at it through the technical lens. We said right at the outset, we're going to try and talk about this in terms of what it means for the average South African. They may not see it as optimistic as we perhaps see it, but your closing comments.
Yeah, so I think take the good where it lies. I think that you said it at the start, they're operating against a very difficult global backdrop. If you look at the cost of servicing debt, all over the world has gone up. It's not unique in South Africa. Nomathibana is a bond manager. She'll tell you the US could fund at less than 1% 2 years ago for 10 years, and now they fund at 4%. So it's the cost of debt all over the world has gone up. Volatility has gone up, and South Africa is unfortunately operating within that storm. We've scored a couple of own goals. This budget is trying to address some of those own goals. But as South Africans, we're a resilient nation, so we have to just keep battening down the hatches and be a bit more patient. We're trying to, or National Treasury is trying to accommodate where they can. And I think a practically sound budget for everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's where we'd leave it with a comment of patience and a practically sound budget delivered by Minister Enoch Godongwana earlier this afternoon. I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening online, and especially a very, very hearty thanks and a sincere word of appreciation to the two guests in studio, Nomathibana as well as Nadir. From all of us here at Region Business School in our Cape Town campus, we thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you on campus very soon. All of the best. Bye-bye.